All right, so we've finished looking at the medical and behavioral section, and that section was pretty quick to look at. This section is a little bit more complex to explain, so I want to, we'll take our time. Right now we're looking at the patterns of need analysis, and this analysis really grew out of multiple sort of forums where people were asking questions like, so we have this entire population of individuals who have intellectual and developmental disabilities, and yet we know that different people have different needs. They have different things, different areas of their lives that they have greater needs in or fewer needs in, etc. And how do we understand that at the population level? Obviously, looking at one person's assessment versus another person's assessment would help us to look at the differences between two individuals. But when we have something like, 25,000 individuals, that becomes a different kind of a question. So what we're looking at here is what's called a cluster analysis. And what that does is it says, all right, across these different attributes, can we create clusters or groups of people who have similar attributes or similar patterns or profiles across those different attributes? And the attributes that we're talking about here right now are just attributes from the SIS assessment itself. And specifically, we're talking about the subscale scores. So the medical, behavioral, home living, community living, safety, learning, lifelong learning, employment, etc. So all of those areas that we've talked about as the subsections in previous analyses that we've detailed, those are the domains that we're looking to find patterns in. So we're looking across really 9 dimensions of this population and saying, are there people who have similar patterns across those 9 dimensions? So what you see on the screen here on the left side is where we can choose how many different clusters of people how many different clusters or groups of people do we want to identify? And we're trying to find the clusters that have the most distinct characteristics throughout that cluster. So here, so let's backtrack just a second. You might have multiple reasons for asking this question. And this actually gets back to some of the places where we were asked this question, which is why this analysis was created. We have tried to, identify some example case studies or use cases for using this kind of analysis. So one example might be you might want to build a specialized team. Like you might want to say, all right, we want to have a specialized set of supports coordinators who are trained to coordinate needs around a particular set of issues, right? So whether that's medical concerns, whether that's employment, etc., that there might be a specific sort of specialized group that you might want to assign to a given population. So that's one use case. You might also want to say, wait, all right, so are there areas where we actually have training needs, where we do trainings for people who are providing services to individuals with intellectual or developmental disorders, and those trainings need to include issues that are relevant to the population that's being served, this could help to identify some of the areas where there are a high level of needs that may not be included in training. So those are just two use cases. So based on your use case, you might have a need to say like, oh, okay, so I maybe only have the staff to create specialized teams for 4 groups of people. You can change this number based on whatever your particular use is. So if you only had 4, then you can change this and it should update to find the most distinct 4 groups that it can find throughout the entire population. So we're going to go back to 5, which is the default. All right, and so this table that we're looking at over on the right-hand side of the screen, this is just showing us the summary information about each of these 5 clusters. And what it's showing is the number of people who are in that cluster, and then their average score, the average score of people who are in that cluster across all of these different life areas or subscales. So we can click on this chart. Like I mentioned earlier, you can click on pretty much anything and something will probably happen. So you can sort by the number of people, and by doing this, we see that there are some distinct subgroups, and that the smallest groups actually are the ones with the greatest amount of need. Need here being, as I said, the average score on that subscale, and it's actually the average scaled score on the subscale, because we had to scale each of those scores so that they were comparable between the medical and behavioral subscales, which have a different scoring, different type of scoring. So when we look at this table, we can see, the thing that obviously pops out is that some squares are darker than others. And the darker a square is, the more need there is, or the higher the average need is in a given area for that group of people. So here we see that this smallest group of people, which is cluster 2 here, this smallest group of people has higher than average medical needs, and then really higher than average needs across most of these support areas, all the way across the board. But that's the smallest group of people. We also can see that the second smallest group of people, 2,590 across the state at this time, that they have some more moderate needs, not as high as the needs of the people in the initial cluster that we looked at, but that this second group has higher behavioral needs. So the average behavioral scores of this group are higher than in any other group. So if we were going to try to sort of, characterize these groups, we'd say the smallest group has high medical needs and then high needs across all support needs, but relatively low behavioral needs compared to this second group, which really has moderate needs across all of the domains, but especially high needs in this behavioral area. And those two groups together comprise, so we have 1,823 and 2,590. Those two groups together make up a pretty substantial group of people with some pretty intense needs, it looks like. If we then go down to the next largest population, we can see that the average scores here are really the lowest among any of these groups. And it makes sense that this is also a relatively small group, right? So if we think back to the histogram, we don't even need to think back here. We can just go back to the histogram. So we know that this group of people down here, while the supports needs index doesn't include the medical and behavioral, so we're looking at a few more dimensions when we're looking at that cluster analysis. My guess is that people who are on this lower end of the support needs index are some of those same people who are in this group with lower scores here, since these are the domains that make up the support needs index. Similarly, I would guess that some of these people with higher needs are the ones that show up on the right-hand side of that histogram. So you can see how it's the same underlying data is helping to inform multiple different ways of looking at it, multiple types of analysis. So that is the summary of these clusters, and it helps us to, so what we've been able to do then is to say, all right, so we have these two smaller populations with high medical and high behavioral needs. And then we have another relatively small population with pretty low support needs. But then these other larger groups, which would be in the middle of that distribution, most likely. And those folks have, not surprisingly, sort of moderate needs compared to the others who were assessed. And again, this is always compared to the rest of the population that's been assessed, which is a population that where every person who is in that population meets the criteria for receiving services. So, okay, so here again we're looking at averages, and like we've said before, an average contains a wide array of different scores inside of it. So this paints a pretty high-level picture of, it lets us say something about an entire population and that, that group's medical needs or that group's behavioral needs. But inside of that population, there's still going to be variation. And because we don't want to go too far down the road to abstracting this data and making it impossible to see the individual people that make up that data, this data set. What that means, though, of course, is that we have to be ready for some complexity. So get ready, because this next way of looking at the data does take a little bit of explaining, but we'll make it through. Okay, so when we're looking at trying to visualize these groups, you'll recall I said that those clusters of different patterns of need were made across 9 different dimensions, right? So like those 9 dimensions are each of those subscales. It's really hard to visualize 9 dimensions at the same time and to keep that all in your mind, right? So what we did is we tried to press the boundaries a little bit, and instead of just doing 2 dimensions at a time, we tried to say, like, all right, let's actually allow people to look at 3 dimensions at a time, and then also change the size so that it's actually a 4th dimension in there. So, and let's try to do this visualization to get a sense of the differences between these groups. So we know that, so we want to look at the medical dimension, the behavioral dimension. There's some difference here in the home dimension. And so we'll include, and then we can also include, let's say, safety and advocacy. So what we will do, we'll say medical, behavioral, home, and then let's do safety down here. And by selecting these, we're selecting the different dimensions of this visualization that we can click on in this tab to the right. Now, what's going to show up here is, so for those of you who know what a scatter plot is, this is really just a scatter plot in 3 dimensions. So it's almost like 2 scatter plots in one. And a scatter plot shows one measure on one axis and another measure on another axis. And this has 3 separate axes, right? So here, the medical score is the x-axis, which is the one going along the bottom here. The behavioral score is the y-axis, which is the one going up along the side over here. And the home living score is the z-axis, which is this one going from front to back. Or if I flip it, the home axis is this one here going along the side, right there. So every single dot in this visualization represents an individual person and shows an individual person's score in each of these areas. So if you recall, when we look at the clusters up here, we saw cluster 2 and 3 are that high medical needs group and that high behavioral needs group. So let's say we just, try to simplify what we're looking at and we just look at 2 and 3. We can see that the medical needs, which fall along this axis over here. So there are more people. So this is group 2 right here, right? So let's see. Yeah, so this is group 2, is this brownish, yellowish color. I don't know, is that goldenrod? I'm not sure what that is. So that color depicts the individuals who were in that high medical needs group. And you can see that really there really are people who have quite high medical needs, even beyond the folks in this group. But there are also, and then if we look at this axis over here, which is the behavioral axis, we see there's this whole set of people who have behavioral needs far and above beyond the behavioral needs that are here for some of these lower people who have lower scores in the behavioral area down here. But what we also notice when we pull out and look at all of the individual observations in here is that there's this group of people right in the middle. And this happens because anytime we draw a line anywhere, somebody ends up on one side or another of that line. But I bring this up just to show that there are ways of looking at, of not just saying like, oh yes, this person clearly goes in this area or another area. And this helps us to look at the real complexity of people, and how it's very hard to come up with a single set of groupings to put people in. The groupings are really more of like a way of doing exploratory analysis and seeing what subgroups there are, but it doesn't apply to an individual person, right? Like this person may have, even though they're in the group 3 here, which we had called the higher behavioral group, they still may have significant medical needs. This person over here as well, right? So this is one way of just digging into the complexity of the data underneath some of these summary tools that we have available as well. One other thing that's worth noting, so we give 2 options for doing clustering if you start to get really interested in the analysis side of this. So by default, we use this k-means clustering, and we also give this option for hierarchical clustering. I will not spend much more time looking at that right now, but to just let you know that on this How tab, there's a more detailed explanation of exactly how clustering is done, with some links to some interactive sites that can sort of give you a tutorial on that, just so you understand it better. And then also, when doing hierarchical clustering, the preferred way to visualize that is with what's called a heat map. So there's a heat map that's available here for when you've done hierarchical clustering. Just a word to the wise, it takes a little bit longer to run the hierarchical cluster for reasons that I won't go into here, but which will probably be explained if you look at the detailed tutorial help over in this how section. So that's it for this section, and next we will move on to the use and planning section. Thank you.